I know you know what this is because it's finally time for some color, baby. Time to turn this line art into a full-fleshed and blooded illustration. So let's get started. Woo! We love talking about the color wheel, right? Everyone always loves talking about the stupid basics. Well, too bad you gotta talk about it because if you don't have a good foundation, how the hell am I supposed to tell you about those various nuances when it comes to skin, right? First things first, do we know what our three primary colors are? Three primary colors can be indicated by this triangle of Illuminati. It's going to be rojo, yellow, and blue. And why do we call these primary colors? Because with this big old trio, with these three basic colors, you can create just about any color on this color wheel. So like basic kindergarten color mixing, what makes orange? Red plus yellow equals orange. What makes green? Blue plus yellow. Purple, red plus blue. And then you can just see all the little subtleties. This blue-green comes from mixing blue and green, obviously. Again, mixing these two gets you in between colors. Mixing these two gets you in between colors. And so knowing these three, the primary trio, the three musketeers, the ultimate trifecta, will allow you to grasp creating any other color you want. And if you realize that Photoshop works in RGB or CMYK color, and we're in RGB color right now, that's where our whole idea of like RGB comes from. It's the whole idea of three main colors being used to mix together and create other colors. And if you try to make these colors, make blue, yellow, red, you can't, right? Think about it. How would you make red, right? In the old ways, they would just grind down like little powders or little flowers and create the red dye, but you can't find two color mixes to create red. I mean, if there was a way, that'd be crazy and really interesting. I can't imagine like maybe some imaginary like nude color plus some imaginary fluffy color and then it creates red. But regardless, that's your primary color. And we can distinguish colors based on whether they fall under the warm or the cool spectrum, okay? So we can divide it sort of right down the middle, actually. We have on this side, you're gonna have your warm colors because these are the colors that you think about when you see a fire, when you see desert, when you see the sun. These are the colors that make up those areas. Whereas these colors, cool, are the colors that make up, say, the ocean, make up ice, make up the moon. And so they typically create more of a calming mood, whereas warm colors are much more vibrant and popping. And so they create like this very passionate, very energetic kind of theme mood. And so typically when it comes to opposing colors or complementary colors, you're going to end up seeing that it's warm and cool complement each other, right? So what is the complementary color? Complementary color is a color that resides directly opposite of another color. So say for red, the direct opposite would be a green. Whereas for a blue, be an orange. Purple for yellow. And so on, like the little nuances. And the importance of complementary colors comes from the idea that if you pair these two colors, they bring out the strength and vibrancy of each color. So say if you have like a green field, right? Nice green grass right here. If you add a touch of red in there, that red is going to look a lot more vibrant than say if you put that red on top of a yellow color. Right? That red looks a lot duller here than say here with this green. Same goes for the opposite effect. If I do a red, that green is going to look super vibrant versus here. And so color palettes typically focus on finding right balances of complementary colors and analogous colors. And when I refer to analogous colors, I just mean colors that are right next to one another on the color wheel. Or in this case, in Photoshop, you're going to see this color bar. And a color bar is a little more complex than, say, using a color wheel, just because you have to really know what's your warms and cool, because it doesn't show it to you directly here. So you have to have a good foundation. But back to the color wheel, analysis colors. So you're going to get really interesting color combos, say color palettes that can range, maybe do this kind of effect, which is called a square color palette. Some might just do all this section, and this is like called an analogous color palette. Some might do like crisscross like this or something like that. Regardless of the name for the color palette, what is important is that you understand that you're going to always want to have a good balance of cools and warms when you create a color palette. So even if you were to create a color palette all within this cool region, right? You're going to have colors that are referred to as warmer colors versus the cooler colors. And so this nice magenta would be considered the warmer color, and so those would be like the color you would use to give the impression of, say, a red on a blue background or something like that. And that's where you get the really complex color schemes or lighting schemes, where, say, you might see a character that's in like the nighttime and you want to do a skin color. Well, you might think, oh, maybe I should do a peach color. No, that's wrong, because in the nighttime, that peach color is going to get affected by the blue that's in the light. So it's actually going to turn out to be sort of this purplish kind of color that leans a little bit to the magenta. And that creates sort of your peachy color, right? That's two. Right? And this becomes your sort of peachy color. Now let's show you some of the ways you can create color palettes for your skin. So I'm going to pull up some examples of master artists creating colors for their skin. So some examples. And so you can see that a lot of their colors, their skin palettes, are not necessarily going to be peach. Because while it's great to automatically jump straight to peach, it won't work for more complex lighting situations, especially if you're gonna have, say, golden hour, which is like this really warm, brisk sunlight, in which case maybe your skin leans more towards this yellow orange, like this golden orange, rather than peach. Or if you're in a dark tunnel with these neon signs glowing, maybe your skin tone leans more like this turdish yellow. As you can see here with Mona Lisa, Leonardo da Vinci, he used this yellow ochre color to create her skin, but it still reads as skin because her environment is very green, very murky, and even the browns are these like really muddy, earthy colors. And so let's try to see what color palette he uses by picking out colors, right? So I can safely say that there's going to be some greens in there. That yellow, a bit of that red, and surprise, surprise, this is sort of a purple. And just a tad of that blue is gonna pop in. Oh, whoops. And that blue is essentially just a cooler version of that green here. See how the color is jumping up and down that scale? And so this brings me to the next topic idea, in which when you want to simulate a color, it's not necessarily always the color you think it would be. So I thought that this color would be a blue, right? Because it looks blue in this environment. But when I color picked it, it's actually a green that's super desaturated. And the reason being is that because it's surrounded by all this yellow green, that when you choose a desaturated, slightly cooler green, it's going to give the impression of blue. And so you're basically moving towards the blue, but you're not going to quite make it, right? I think Prokofiev, the artist on YouTube, he has this great series about using the color wheel and how you move over the color wheel as you try to simulate a color, but you never quite reach the color. And as you go towards that color, it tends to, especially if you're going cooler, it's going to tend to be desaturated. So like say if I were to do a skin color, right? If I want to get to blue, I'm going to desaturate my color and then cool it down. Desaturate my color, cool it down. And so it gives the impression of this sort of bluish color. It's not a good example because I have so much gray in here. Let me pull up an example here. This looks sort of blue. Right here, this looks brownish, and it's actually sort of this yellow-green, super desaturated color. Let me try this again. Maybe if I do a big enough area, it's going to help. All right. In fact, this red gray looks sort of purplish. So I'm gonna push this color here. So now that's sort of looking blue, right? I need to cover up more of this orange. So you're gonna get to see how that looks blue there. If we zoom in and look carefully, this color right here looks sort of blue, right? But it's actually a very desaturated green. And because I started moving cooler and more desaturated, that's why we got to blue, even though we didn't move all the way to blue. Whereas if I wanted to get to purple, I have to move this way because purple is all the way up here, right? So I moved to red and I desaturated that color and I created this sort of purpley color. Right, so you can see how when you want to simulate a color from one color, you might not necessarily have to move all the way directly to a blue, right? Because in most cases, it's going to create this weird kind of color, right? If you just put blue on top, it's not going to quite work. And again, you saw with Mona Lisa's color palette that Leonardo da Vinci stayed very much within the very earthy colors, and he has a good range of warm and cool colors. You can see he has his super bright yellow, which he used for her skin, which is going to be like the brightest point of the focus. And then he complemented that with like this purple, this dark purple. And remember, yellow and purple are complementary, so that's why the yellow shines out even more. And then he mixes it with some variations of that purple with this warm red, this kind of more muted, desaturated, darker, cooler red, and it looks purple in that sense. And then we mix it up with a little bit of the greens and the blues, right? And so you have a good balance of mostly, right here, warm, 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 just a sliver of cool. And that helps bring out her face because she's like backdropped by this coolness. Now, what does Rembrandt do? Rembrandt has a little bit more color in his skins. Whereas Mona Lisa is using like primarily just one shade and just varying in darkness, Rembrandt takes the opportunity to include all these various like nuance like blush, subsurface scattering, shadow reflection, all that good stuff. And so his skin is this super bright yellow orange coupled with some blushes that range more in like the salmon orangey color. His chin is this super sort of saturated, darker version of this color, right? You see how that jumps lower and to the right. This is super high up, and that's why it's so bright. For the shadows, he uses a similar saturation, slightly more desaturated, and then he jumps in value because that's how you get that super sharp contrast, right? And this appears green, but it's actually not quite green. In fact, this color is just a slightly more orange version of that yellow, right? Just so slightly. Oh, so slightly. You see how that arrow jumped down just a bit? And that gives the illusion of green. And then you get this super dark brown. Then you get this sort of like magenta-y color. Magenta-y black. His hair. That stuff. And so with artists like Rembrandt, they are very traditional. They use a burnt sienna underpainting, which is why we have such a warm color palette right here, right? Most of these colors are all from this section. He does not really jump up further than that. He doesn't go too crazy. And just using this like really limited palette, he's able to create such a realistic, such a lifelike kind of portrait, right? You notice that he uses blush typically around this section. The chin is super red. The ears catch some of that redness. And that reflected light causes the shadow here to be sort of like burgundy, sienna-ish. This part is super dark and a really like very cooler version of that sienna color that you can see from the chin and everything. And so you know that when you're applying blush, you want to make sure you're focusing on these regions rather than here, because here you don't have that many vessels, and so the chances of actually seeing like redness in your forehead typically is very rare unless you got like a pimple or something, or like you hit your head and you got a bruise. That's for Rembrandt. Now for Park is more adventurous, and he uses quite bold and more non-traditional colors. Like you can see here, he uses this super saturated orange. All right, so you see that he uses sort of contrasting colors you wouldn't think, right? He even goes as far as to really push that shadow into the blue-green region compared to, say, how Rembrandt uses like subdued, more yellowy ochre kind of skin tone. David Park is not afraid to try with colors, and that's something I'm personally still struggling with, but this is why we study masters' works, so we can figure out how they do it and sort of try to incorporate that into our own works, right? So this is like a more blue, which helps echo some of that blue he uses for the lake. He goes as far as to super simplify that face using this bright red to indicate the nose, which is a really interesting kind of contrast and brings attention to his whole face and adds like just a little bit of interest to the whole piece, right? This red looks crazy saturated, but in fact, compared to here on the gray, this looks super desaturated. And that's because color is relative. This red right here is sitting on top of this much darker background, right? And these greens. And so as we mentioned, because red and green are complementary, this is exactly why it shows up as super vibrant here, whereas here it looks very subdued. And so just from this super basic color palette that I'm looking at right now, David Park seems to be using, let's push this over here, a relatively simple color palette of red versus green blue. And his reds range from a more salmon red to a more pink magenta-y red. And then he contrasts that with some colors that look green because yellow is very close to green compared to red. And then a blue-green because that blue-green is, I believe, opposite of this beautiful magenta pink, right? And so that is one sort of non-conventional color palette. All right, we're gonna hide our David Park. Now we're gonna look at more sort of subdued palettes. Here we have this painting by the artist Fairfield Porter. And you can see how simplified he made his skin tones. Basically, it is just two colors. This one and this one. And that is a stylistic choice because Fairfield Porter's whole shtick about his work is that he wants to create really simplified silhouettes. Like you can see just how flat everything looks, right? And so that's why the face, basically he is able to capture the face using just a really strong light source and then a slightly darker version of that. So this color is sort of like this yellowy, yellow-orange kind of light desaturated color versus a more warm color. And so that would mean that this yellow is considered like the cooler side of the skin tone, whereas this is the warmer side because you are going closer to red, which is the warmest of the color of them all, like Charmander or something. And if we look at the overall illustration or overall painting, you can see that his choice to do just such simple colors for his character, the figure's face and skin, it works just because the rest of the background's also really simple and he doesn't use too crazy of a color. Like all the colors are very similar in value. Like besides this really strong shadow of the trees, everything else sits in relatively same saturation. Except for the shirt. And that's how you bring attention to this beautiful green grass. You put it against something that's more desaturated, and so it's gonna look way more vibrant. And he calls back to the skin color by putting that skin color into the mountains. Like you wouldn't think a mountain is a skin color, right? But he has made the choice to add that in there, and it helps echo some of that peachish color and tie the whole piece together. Now, one of my favorite artists, Degas, the French artist, and he is known for like his ballerinas that use like really beautiful oil pastel kind of handiwork, right? And so if we look at his skin palettes, this is a very desaturated red, pink almost, right? Like just look at the color wheel right here. You're basically almost sitting on that gray area and you're pretty much pushing all the way to the red, but it's still reading as peach because it's being placed around in this environment that allows it to shine through as peach. And so the shadows are this orangey color, and this red is now considered a cool color because you're pushing it so far that you're almost at purple. So now it's considered cool rather than warm. If you had pushed it closer to the saturation, then it would be considered more warm. And so this would then become considered as like the warm part of the color palette. You can see like there's just tiny subtleties of warmth in this kind of shadow color. You get this middle ground right here. Slightly more red kind of color here. The tights are super warm. in contrast to this, right? You see, as you go up in saturation, it's gonna look a little bit more warm. This looks cool because you're pushing towards the gray, which is always going to be considered a cool color because, I mean, can you imagine gray in a fire? No, right? But you can imagine it on the moon, and the moon is something that's at night and it's cool. And this super tiny subtlety, right? Super tiny subtlety. Just by cooling off the skin right here, it looks sort of blue and echoes sort of that bluish shadow that he's got for like most of the environment. And that's basically a gray. He's not actually going to blue, but he's creating a gray and placing it against these warmer colors. So that's why they look blue, right? And again, if you notice here, the warm sections of the skin are typically going to be the hand, where the light is bouncing off the most, maybe the cheeks a little bit. Their cheeks are catching some of that light, and mostly their tights, because their tights are like, I believe, a slightly pink tint. And so this balance between like a cooler upper torso versus a warmer upper torso creates this very visually, colorfully, like dynamic kind of contrast, right? Like just imagine it, like cooler versus warmer, right? Helps bring out interest within the two. And then I pop in my little tutu. And already you just kind of see like, oh, that's visually dynamic, right? Visually interesting for you to look at. Whereas if it's all that cool color, you definitely kind of lose the overall shape of the figure. So you kind of need to define it a little better. And so let me put all these color palettes together to summarize the variety of color palettes that different artists use. Oh, before I forget, some more modern examples of great color palettes that I've seen, but I can't show here because I believe it's copyrighted, is artists like Lois Van B. I don't know her last name, but she goes by Loish on IG and DeviantArt and everywhere. And she's an artist from the Netherlands, and she has such a great grasp of color that she's able to use super non-conventional color palettes. Like I've seen her use blue for skin, green for skin, and it looks so, the color harmony is so great. She's able to complement that blue skin with like this beautiful magenta purpley kind of color. And so it still reads as skin, even though we don't actually have blue skin, right? As with other artists like Sam Does Arts, he has a predominantly very warm, very golden hour kind of skin color palette that I just love so much, because with that color palette, he's able to play around a lot with that concept of rim light, bounce light, and the way your hand, because you have so much blood vessel and your cheeks have so much blood vessel, when it's hit by this super strong light source, it creates this beautiful, like super saturated reddish orange kind of thing. So I highly recommend you check those types of artists out. If I think of any more artists, I'll be sure to include it in the PDF where I describe our class exercise and everything in more detail, and I give examples. But basically, look at what other artists are doing, and it'll really help you develop a sense for how you want to develop skin palettes, right? And so back to putting all of these together. And so essentially what you see here is a running pattern, is that most skin colors in general are gonna be ranging in this red-orange kind of area. And because it's red-orange kind of thing, that means the complementary colors are typically gonna be around in the greens and blues areas, and maybe even the purples, right? And the only exception is maybe with Rembrandt's color palette, because he is such a traditional artist that in traditional painting, he's working mostly with earthy tone colors, and his underpainting is earthy toned, and so all his colors remain in like the warm area region, but he's slightly varying based on saturation, based on intensity, based on darkness, in order to create the illusion of a complementary color, right? As I mentioned, this color right here is like a yellow orange almost closer to red orange color. It looks green against that skin palette. And so we have like sort of a reddish color. So it's going to be highlighted even more once you put that on top of this, right? And so for the rest of this lesson, I'm just going to be going back to that first portrait that we made in the first Portraits 101, and I'm going to be applying color to it. I'm going to be playing around, maybe amping up the color and the shadows because it's a little boring to keep doing the same thing. And for the class exercise, I welcome you to try doing this with me, where you also try to turn this into a more colorful kind of portrait. And you're going to get to play around. One where you're doing more traditional color palette, and a second one where maybe you choose a more non-conventional color palette, where maybe you choose the skin to be, say, a magenta, and then you're choosing the shadow to be a turquoise or something like that, right? Really push yourself, experiment. If it doesn't work out, obviously don't worry about it. You can always try again, and maybe the next time when you have a better grasp of how to mix those colors, then you can try again and maybe you'll be successful, right? And so let's just get started. Again, this time I'm doing my stylistically alterated kind of version. Because I work faster that way. And so again, we're going to get her square jaw. You would think by this many times that I've done her, I would have become an expert. But unfortunately, my brain doesn't work like that. I'm not that smart. I need to do this at least 200 times before I become like a total expert and I'm able to do this, like close my eyes and automatically do it, right? Put in those big old ears of hers. O color, wherefore art thou color? Whether 'tis nobler of the mind to forget you, to give up on you, or to submit and attempt to become greater. That is but the question. I really just try to recall all of my high school knowledge of Macbeth, was it? I think it was Macbeth. The one where it's like, to be or not to be, that is but the question. Whether it is nobler of the mind and soul to blah 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 blah. I did not like that play. So if you're reading it right now, or if you remember enacting it in high school, I feel your pain. Thank goodness we are out of there, right? Never have to read that again. I feel like there's something about reading classic literature outside of like mandatory school that makes it slightly more bearable. Because I believe a couple years back I was reading East of Eden, and that is a book that typically AP English students read in my school, but I did not take AP English because I did not want to torment myself. And so when I read it, I was like, you know, this actually isn't bad. I have the time to actually take my time to like get to understand the story without having to stress about what does this particular conflict mean, or like what is the meaning behind this symbol, or that kind of stuff. Like, come on, man. Sometimes the story is just a story. Just deal with it. Gotta capture that shoulder slant. And so you see here that I'm trying to get that downturned look without making her eyes like super, super crazy downturned. I'm trying to get rid of this bad habit of zooming in too quickly, so I'm going to refrain from zooming in further than this, especially in this sketching stage, because honestly, you don't need to look so closely at like whether you're capturing all the little eyelashes. What your goal is right now is to like get the overall shape of the face and not necessarily like, oh, is her eyelash looking good or not, you know. We'll see if this time I get her lips right. As you know, I struggled with those lips for a hot second there. Something about it not sitting right with me. Same with the nose, not sitting right with me. But I seem to have gotten it last time when I did it stylistically, so here's to hoping. We're gonna make sure that she's not cross-eyed, which totally super easy to do because you get too focused on like one eye and then you draw the irises too close together and you're like, oh shoot, now it's just looking like she's making a fool out of me. Alright, we'll just call that sketch. And let's clean up those lines by doing a thinner sketch, so then when we actually color this and merge it, we're not going to have a pain in the butt trying to fix everything. Photoshop, respond. And we're also going to be a little bit looser, not doing as many lines. Making sure her hair has volume so she's not looking like a flat mess like my hair looks like sometimes. I really need to get a haircut at this point. Get that neck in there. Slope it. And we're going to make sure she has sort of a pout rather than a smile, which is, needless to say, going to be interesting to try to capture. Her top mouth is relatively straight, with only the corners tilting up just ever so slightly. Her bottom lip is parted. She's got sort of a button nose, I guess. Throw in those nostrils. Throw in that eyelid crease. Eyelid crease. Thicken up my line to get her eyelashes. Same for this side. I noticed that her inner corner on this side is a little more elongated, so I'm going to capture that. All right, that's a good old sketch. First things first, I'm gonna be exaggerating the saturation, so I'm gonna lay down sort of this yellow-orange kind of color right here. Pretending maybe it's like golden hour or something, because that's like the most interesting color palettes, in my opinion at least. Push it down a little bit more to that orange, just ever so slightly. And I'm gonna lock that layer, and I'm gonna lay down the shadow, which I'm gonna make a slightly more red-orange kind of color. And you'll see here that this is a slightly more saturated version. We're gonna get that really bright pinkish color by pushing our way down into the saturation and towards the red. Erase that stitch. Getting our saturation, and we're gonna now lay down like the reddish parts of the face. So it's gonna be primarily this area, the blush obviously, her eyes because she's got this makeup on. And I'm gonna push it slightly darker, as you can see in the image. Squint your eyes, her eye shadow is darker. And to get that blush color, we're going to increase the saturation just a slight bit. Push down to the red area. Do the same idea. And we're going to make sure we capture that bounce light by going slightly up towards that yellow and desaturating. And we're going to get this beautiful sort of green-blue kind of color. Right there. Right, you see that? Bring back that warmth in that ear. Make sure that you're checking your navigation every so often. And we're going to create that deeper shadow by going down and slightly more saturated. So if the light is desaturated, then the shadow is going to be saturated and vice versa, right? So this yellow right here, this color right here, just medium saturation. So when it comes to the shadows, we can push our saturation just the slightest. And with this color, I'm going to push really into saturation as if to simulate the lighting glow that bounces, right? From subsurface scattering. We're gonna lighten up this region ever so slightly by bringing it up to that yellow. We're gonna use our lasso so we get this really neat edge. And we're gonna recapture her eye bag or her under eye. And your dark eye circles are typically more desaturated in color. And right here, we're gonna jump up to the yellows slightly and desaturate it to get that lighting source and have a good balance of saturation and non-saturation, right? You see that the ends of her eyeshadow dip into this browner region, so I'm not going to push it into the reds anymore, I'm just going to bring it down. Right here, same goes. I'm not going to push it to the red regions anymore, I'm just going to push it down to get that desaturated kind of brown color. And you notice in her eye fold is this super saturated red shadow, right? And we're going to use a gray for the eyeballs to create that sense of blue, and we're going to push it up into the yellow regions, even the green regions actually. Push it into gray. throw in our eyebrows real quick before we forget. And we're gonna choose this desaturated kind of brown color that's sort of dark, super desaturated, in order to simulate that kind of gray color you got going on here. Push it up. And so for her eyes, I noticed that they're this sort of greenish, ambery kind of color. So I'm gonna lay down that green in there. And again, it's gonna be more of that kind of color rather than a green. And then we're gonna go darker as we have the shadow up here. Go darker, almost to black. And drop in our little eye pupil. And then just do a touch of light right there. Right? Very subtle. We go desaturate to create that sort of blue kind of color. We're gonna go all the way up to our greens right here to create our highlight. Just gonna add a hint of that green blue in there, make it a little more interesting for us to look at. Same goes for this side. We're gonna make this a kind of yellowish green kind of color. Then we're gonna lay down our kind of amberish color. And then we're going to add our shadow, push it slightly to the red, make it slightly more warm. And then desaturate it slightly to get closer to that pupil color. Super desaturated, get that eye pupil. Right there, right? And then we're going to bump ourselves up to that yellow, lighten it up, add that kind of ring glow. And again, we're going to add some of that green blue in there to try to spice it up a bit before we merge these layers and try to paint all together. Get that nostril shadow in there. merge these. Gotta flip the canvas so we're dissociating ourselves. Liquefy. After so long you've been looking at like the same direction, it's really helpful to flip your canvas over, see what you're messing up. Alright, and you see like I fixed a major bunch, right? Get that shadow in there. Gotta push down her jaw a little bit because she has a more square jaw than this. You see how I'm balancing out the saturation with more desaturated colors, so the saturated colors are going to read as super saturated. Especially if my shadows are going to be really saturated, then the light's got to be slightly less saturated as a cardinal rule. Alright, and you know my favorite, we're gonna flip this canvas 180 so we no longer recognize it. And we're gonna start fixing stuff up. Zoom, 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 zoom. To about the same size as that picture. Alright, we're gonna keep this upside down while we paint and fix some stuff. Because we want to make sure we're not looking at the face as a whole, but we're looking at the shapes. And what you're going to recognize for gold jewelry is that you're going to have a warm section that's reflective of the skin, right? And then you're going to have cooler, more yellow greenish area where the light is actually hitting it. All right, time to flip it back and see how we're doing. 180. Not bad. Again, we got the likeness again. And that's how you know practice makes perfect, and always dissociate your faces so you're not seeing an actual face. And that's really the key to being able to get likeness down, no matter how many times they ask that of you, right? Fix that issue of the unibrow. And we're just going to do finishing touches using a sort of reddish brown to do the hair strands. Make sure we add in our little bitty freckles. Let's scroll through. 271. Yes, this one maybe. All right, and I will consider that done for this one. And so for your classic set exercise, try doing something similar to this where you're using more normal color palettes, and then do one where it's a little more wild. Say like maybe you went wild and you decided I want to make her shadows blue, and then her skin's gonna be an orange, right? Who knows? But I would recommend you look up some artists that you like, or just look up non-conventional skin color palettes and try it out for yourself and see if you can make it work, right? And I will talk to you next time where we will finally go over different lighting sources and some of the most common ones and how you can use that kind of knowledge to interpret the colors that you see.